I'm just going to tell you what little bit I know about the ice business and how it started and how the ice was stored and cut and handled during the summer. Of course, I grew up in the Iceman's family. That was my dad, George Mortensen, and my mother, Rebecca Jacobson Mortensen. They lived at 980 South Main, which now would be right across the street east from Macy's parking lot south of Logan at about 1000 South. Our address was 980 South Main. I guess Dad got interested in this business soon after he was married, because he worked for Evans Ice Company, who manufactured ice on approximately 2nd North and 6th West in Logan. I guess when he got down to the south part of town here and saw a big excavation with nothing in it, it gave him the idea that it could be filled with water for an ice pond. The reason for this big excavation was that someone had excavated about 5 feet deep and between 1.5 acres and 2 acres of land for the purpose of getting the clay to make brick with. So that's the reason the ice pond was there. Now, when I first remember it as a child, I guess from maybe 6 years and on, that ice pond was always full of tall grass-like pasture in the summertime. Well, it was necessary to cut that long grass with a mower, the same as they cut alfalfa with, and rake it and haul it out of the pond before we'd start filling it with water. After the biggest part of the grass was gone and had been hauled away, then it was necessary to rake the entire pond with hand rakes, garden rakes. And we did this twice to make sure we got all of the loose grass that we possibly could so that it didn't float up into the ice later. So after that was done, then we would start filling the pond with water, maybe the 1st of November or late October. And it would take approximately 5 days to fill the pond, 5 or 6 days. The water would come down the irrigation ditch which ran past the east end of the pond and came from the Logan River. However, no one was using the water in the wintertime except us. So we would have to walk that ditch and clean it and fix the banks or whatever was necessary in order to get the water to come from the river, which was approximately, I would think, 1.5 miles. And this irrigation ditch came out of the Logan River on the north side of River Heights and followed the River Heights hill around to 7th South, and then from there through the fields down to the ice pond. After the pond was full, we would leave the water on all winter long so that it was filling and emptying all the time to keep the water more pure and clean. But just before freeze up, which was usually soon after Thanksgiving, then we would walk around the pond and rake whatever grass the wind had blown to the sides, and it was considerable. You'd get big rakefuls of short grass to rake out. Until the ice started freezing over, usually the kids, myself included, would take garden rakes and walk around the 3 edges of the pond that were open. On the east end there were willows that came right down to the water's edge, and so we never bothered with that. And we would rake this loose ground out on a windy day, loose grass out of the pond on a windy day, because it would blow it over to one side or the other. And as I was saying, you would take out rakefuls of grass, sometimes 6 of them in one place, but there would be some on the entire edge where the wind had blown it. Usually it was the north edge for some reason. where the grass ended up. Well, then soon after that, the ice would start freezing, and usually by Christmas time it was thick enough to allow a horse to walk on the ice, and that had to be about 6 inches thick in order to do that. The horse was the very integral part of the whole ice storing business. They did all the hard work, except there was plenty of other hard work to do. So as the ice would get thicker so that a man or men could get out on it, we would have to keep the snow off of the ice every time it snowed, because the snow insulated the ice from freezing as fast as it would if the snow were removed. Now, if you want to see the snow plow that we used to use this is the snow plow we used to remove the snow from off of the ice pond. Here you can see the marks where we have marked the ice before this small snowstorm came. But this ice pond was approximately 2 acres, so it was a big job to scrape all that snow off, going every direction we could with a horse in order to help the ice to freeze thicker. Now here it's at least 6 inches thick, or we wouldn't have the horse out on the ice.
Okay, identify the people.
Now this is my brother Wally leading the horse this day. I think I took the picture, at least I remember it very well. This is my brother Emery, looks like he's about froze. And this is my older sister Leora's husband, Paul Rose. So I think all 4 of us were out there this day scraping snow off the pond. As I said, these marks here mark out the blocks of ice. They're approximately, looking down here now, they're approximately 3 feet long, 18 inches wide, and this must have been an exceptionally cold year this year, because that ice, showing this ice block here, is approximately 16 inches thick. Here is my dad standing here. I can tell him easily enough by the way he stands.
I'm going to get a little bit to the side because I've got a glare there. Okay.
Okay, and I don't recognize these other fellows that are working here when this particular picture was taken. As I said, the ice has all been marked out here. What we would do, we had a plow which was like holding on to a garden plow, except it had a 6-foot blade that went out in front of the handles, and the blades on that plow, each tooth was approximately 6 or 7 inches long and 6 or 8 inches deep, and the teeth ran for approximately 5 or 6 feet horizontal. The plow was also built so that it had a gauge on it. So if we were plowing the width of the block here, approximately 18 inches, we went the full length of the pond, pulling that plow by hand to get the first straight line. Then we would go 90 degrees the other way and go through the center of the pond, pulling the plow by hand, usually 3 of us, and that plow would dig in approximately 2 inches each time it went over. Then, as we got the 2 center marks onto the ice, we would just flip the gauge, the 18-inch gauge, over and plow another strip, full length. Usually we mark the whole pond the first time before it snowed or whatever. And then as the ice was cut to be taken, floated down and into the barn, you had to, what we call, plow the ice without the gauge on. We would get up at approximately 6 o'clock in the morning, 2 hours before daylight, and start plowing these lines, not the full length of the pond, just enough that we knew we would be cutting for that day. And then of course we'd have to go the other way. After going over each line approximately 3 times, the ice would be cut to a depth of about 6 inches. Then usually we would take out about a 20 block strip at a time and cut that 20 block strip all the way full length of the pond in a day or two's time. As we got the channel open, as you can see here, we're cutting ice way up on the east side of the pond, floating it down, hooking it with an ice hook, which these men are holding here. And one man could drag those 20 block sections down, around the corner, and over here to the chutes, where this man would be standing with a flat bar with a blade on it about 5 inches long, and as he hit in between each block where it had been plowed 6 inches deep, those blocks would break off, and this is what you would end up with. A block of approximately 18 inches one way, 3 feet the other way, and whatever the thickness of the ice was. Now, several times as we were starting to fill the barn with ice, we would get a thawing day or a January thaw, and the ice would become spongy, and sometimes the horse would fall through the ice, and the only way to get the horse out of the pond was to cut a 3 to 5 foot channel clear to the edge of the pond so the horse could swim and walk over to the edge of the pond and walk out. He could not get back up on the ice. In the first place, you couldn't get his front legs up on the ice, and if you had, he would have just broken it off again. I can remember 2 horses that were lost due to hyperthermia from being in the ice pond too long. When they would go in, we'd hurry and cut the channel as quick as we could, get them out, rub them down, take them to the barn, cover them with blankets. But as I remember, 2 of the horses died from hypothermia, from being in the water too long. Okay, now we've got the channel cut. See, they've been putting ice in the barn here a couple or 3 days because they have a channel cut clear to the top of the pond up where those willows are. Now, just a point of interest, see how thin the willows are here at this particular year when we're putting up ice? This here would be approximately 20 or 25 years later, and see how the willows have filled in that 25 years of time. So we know that this was back near the time when they first started to harvest ice for the Natural Ice Company, which our company was named, and which supported the family for approximately 35 years. Barn. I'm told that there was another ice barn built before this one that burnt to the ground when I was approximately 2 years old. Now, I think that this is myself, Bob Mortensen, up here. This is my stepdad, Harry Mullen. This is my brother Wally. Normally, we would have sawdust piled from about where Harry's standing here entirely across the end of the barn, which was approximately 30 feet, and piled as high as this reinforcing beam is here. These beams went through the barn, 2 of them each way. Here's the other one up here. And they had cables attached to them that went to the other end of the barn and hooked onto another beam similar to this, both this way and this way through the barn. There'd be a terrific pressure once the barn was filled with ice and sawdust, especially in the summer when the sawdust would start settling and getting heavier and heavier with the water from the ice. Now, the ice barn was filled every year from the bottom up to approximately this height here, or as I remember, about 13 layers of ice up on edge. The ice being taken up the chute and quite high up into the barn. So at this point, they've probably been cutting ice for 3 or 4 days, and they have the barn filled up to about 2/3 full here. You can see this particular year the ice was extra thick. Normally we would pull 3 blocks of ice in at a time, but being this ice is so thick this year, they're only taking 2. One of the funny things that would happen, every once in a while this hook would slide off after the ice was maybe almost into the barn here. Well, this fellow here had a rope tied to the hook, and he's the one that dropped it down behind these blocks of ice as they came in through the chutes here from the pond. And then as it got to the top and the hook was released from the ice and the ice blocks went sliding into the center of the barn, then he would pull the hook back down with the rope that he had in his hand here. Now this hook would pull the ice up. There would be a pulley up in the ice barn attached to some heavy beams that we would lean against the side of the barn in order to hold the pulley. Then the cable would go up through this pulley and back down to a post buried in the ground, which stayed there year after year, where there was another pulley. Cable would go through that. There'd be a horse waiting here, and that's what the end of the cable would be hooked to, was the back of a single horse. So the horse would walk out this way, pulling the ice up into the barn. As the hook was released from the ice up here, of course the horse would be out 50 or 60 feet away from the starting point and would turn around again. This fellow would bring the hook back down. These guys would have the ice pulled in here and ready to hook onto again. And that would go on all day long and day after day for 5 or 6 days. Here is another angle of pictures being taken at the same time, and this is the head of the horse that was pulling on the cable and pulling the ice into the barn. This is my Uncle Eph standing here. That's Mother's brother, Ephraim Jacobson. Here's another picture of him standing here, and he was the one that was bringing the blocks in from out here in the water into the chute, which is 2 wooden structures built out into the water like a boat ramp, only it was for ice instead of a boat. Like I was saying, when we would get a thawing day in the middle of January or February, it would cause us a lot of problems, and especially if when this ice was being pulled up, it caused the hook to tear off of the ice, because the ice wouldn't be as hard as it would be on a real cold day. And the blocks of ice would come sailing down that chute, and of course hitting into the water between those 2 chutes where these men are standing. And so someone would holler loud and clear when that hook came off so that they could get off of the road, or else they'd get water all over them as that ice blocks hit the water. Well, one day a fellow was standing here like this one is now, and he was helping there on the chutes, and this was in 1947, which was the last year that we stored ice. Up until then, the state health department would come and test the ice for purity. It would always test 99 and 9900s pure. But in 1947, we were starting to get environmentalists and that sort of people, and they stopped us from storing ice after 1947 because of the possibility of contaminating the water, being that it was an open pond. By that time, anyway, they were starting to make refrigerators once again after World War II. And so people started buying electric refrigerators. So much larger part of the population then started to have the electric refrigeration. And of course the ice business went downhill and downhill until 1953. When I came home from the service in in 1946,
Six.
Harry, my stepfather, didn't feel like he could run the business any longer. He was quite a heavy fellow, and I think he was more tired than he was unable. But anyway, he did not want anything more to do with the ice business if he had to do it himself. So I volunteered to take over the ice business, even though it wasn't something I necessarily wanted to do, but none of the other boys were interested in doing it. And so I ran the ice business from 1946 to 1953, which is when we stopped delivering ice and stopped selling ice. There was still ice available at that time then from artificial ice making machines and the such. 1947 then, we had hired an older fellow that lived just down the street from Mother's house. His name was Ezra Kidman. He was married to Cecil Kidman, who was one of Mother's best friends. He came to work for us, and he was standing here on the chute. I don't remember what his job was. And it was one of those days when the weather was moderating and thawing. Someone hollered that the hook had come loose, and so all three fellows that were on the wood chutes there jumped off to the side. But Ezra Kidman was a heavy guy. I imagine he weighed probably 275. Jumped in off this side of the chute, and you can see there that the water's on the ice even on this cold day. But anyway, he went right through the ice, and his feet hit the bottom of the pond, which was about 4.5 feet deep at that point. I dashed over to help Ezra out because he was an older man and not used to that kind of work in the first place. And as I reached for him, he says, "Just wait a minute," he says, and he reached in his front pocket. He says, "Yeah, I've got my keys." I says, "Okay, Ezra, let's get you out of there before you freeze to death." He says, just a minute. And he reached down in his back pocket to see if his wallet was still there. He says, "Yeah, it's here." He says, "Okay, now you can pull me out." So about 3 of us got a hold of him and yanked him out of the water, and I took him out to his car. He had his car parked out in front of Mother's house out on the Highway 89, which was the main road going from Logan to Salt Lake. And just as I was helping him into the car, and of course he was getting colder and colder and colder, his wife came walking down the street. She had been up to town buying groceries because he had to have the car to drive to work that morning. So as she came close to us and I was helping in the car, she says, "Well, so this is the way you do it." He says, "You drove the car to work and said you had to have it, and so I had to walk to town and get groceries. And now here you are going home at 10 o'clock in the morning." I still laugh about it every time I think of him being cussed out for going home because he was about froze to death. Well, okay, we're going to show how the ice was put into the barn. As it came in here, right from the lowest layer in the barn to the top, it would fill up approximately 18 inches each time a new layer was started. The ice blocks were turned up on edge so that they were about 18 inches higher than the layer below them. And the ice was tilted up on the edge. We had 2 men up in the barn we called stackers. Another man was there to push the ice with one of those ice pokes to wherever they were stacking at the time. And then these 2 guys would take the block of ice, put it in place against the last block that had been stood up, and stand the new block of ice up against it. They would get a complete layer stacked, and then we would have to go back and raise the chute up another 18 inches to get to the next layer. And then that layer of ice would be stacked directly onto the first layer. There was never any sawdust put between the layers to keep the ice frozen for in the summer. We would wait until the barn was entirely full, and at that point we would have approximately 1,000 tons of ice in the barn. When the barn was full, then we would take this big sawdust pile which we had here, which we added to every year, but we used the sawdust over and over again year after year. There was a little sawmill, Hiram Niederhauser's sawmill, just up the street from the ice barn, about a block and a half. So every year we would go up to Highs and get a couple of big loads of sawdust and add to that which we had left over from the year before. And at this point, we're probably pulling up the last box of sawdust. We had a big wooden box hooked to a steel cable which went up through this pulley, back down in front of the truck to another pulley which was hooked to a permanent post. And at this time, this must have been around 1930, close to 1940. And this is our ice delivery truck which Wally has been driving. He had the cable hooked to the front bumper of the truck. Harry would fill the box with sawdust here. The cable would go from the front of the truck over to a pulley hooked to a post, then up through this pulley up here, down to the box, and as it backed the truck up at this point, instead of leading a horse, would pull the box up here. As it got up near the top, then myself, who I think this is right here, would reach out and grab the box, and Wally would stop the truck in the box. Then I would pull it in and dump it into a big pile below the platform where I'm standing. At that point, we would distribute the sawdust entirely over the top of the top layer of ice, approximately 8 inches deep, thick. And as they were stacking the ice to fill the barn, they would keep the ice away from the edge of the barn, approximately 8 inches, all the way up. Each layer, one on top of the other, would be kept away, 8 inches away on all 4 sides of the barn. Then as we would pull the sawdust up, usually we'd have 2 fellows working up here with wheelbarrows, and they would wheelbarrow the sawdust over and dump it down the sides of the barn. And that is what kept the ice from melting entirely, was this sawdust. Believe it or not, that ice would last up to 2 years if it were properly covered with sawdust. And I can remember the one year when we started stacking ice on the old layer of ice rather than taking it out of the barn and just letting it melt. We started stacking right on top of the last year's layer of ice and filled the barn again. So sawdust was a pretty good insulator. As we would take the ice out to deliver or to sell in the yard, we would uncover what we thought we needed for that day, and we had big steel bars with a flat space on the end of the bar, about 5 inches wide and approximately 1/4 of an inch to 1/2 an inch thick. And as the ice was uncovered, you could see where the blocks were, and you just drop that bar between the blocks, and usually they would just pop apart, and you could get a hold of the block of ice with a pair of tongs, straddle the block, and carry and drag it over to where we were going to load it on the truck. This is the old ice barn from the west side, and our house is out this way, further in front of it. We would back the trucks back in there 20 feet to where there was a platform built about the height of the truck beds. Then if we were taking ice from way up on the top layer of ice, we would drag it over to an opening, and we had a dropping pit there with sawdust in it, and whoever was dragging it over would bring it over to that point and then drop the ice, whether it was down 20 feet early in the summer or after several layers been taken off. It would be 10 feet, 5 feet until we get to the bottom. Then the ice was we'd stand it up on a platform, which you can't see on this picture, but it's back in there right about 20 feet. Stand it up, wash it off with a hose, and use an ice chipper to help take some of the frozen sawdust off until it was completely free of sawdust before we would load it on the trucks. Then of course we'd take it uptown and we delivered to all of the cafes, all of the places that sold beer, and then throughout the town for those who had ice boxes. Now many of the people had no ice box or no refrigerator in those days, in the 30s and 40s. They started buying refrigerators in about 1940, I would guess. And then as the war started in 1941, they quit making refrigerators and of course turned the facilities over for the war movement. In this picture, Dean is standing in the middle. Emery is over here. He's in high school, probably a senior. I'm standing over here, and I'm probably just a sophomore in high school. Or possibly it's a year or two later than that, because I think this was just before I went in the service, after I'd graduated from high school. And there's the old Iceborne in the background. This was our swing here, and all the kids in the neighborhood loved this swing because it had about 20-foot ropes on it way up into this poplar tree. We would swing in that swing and then see who could jump the furthest after pumping ourselves up to the highest point we could. But when we were busy in the summertime selling ice, we had people coming down to our yard, especially on Sunday, to get ice to make ice cream with. But they would come all days of the week, either to make ice cream or to take home and put in their own ice box. Sometimes, or soon after I took over the managing the ice business in 1946, we had about 300 customers up at the college, and these were the young kids coming home from the service who had nothing but an ice box, of course, and they were lucky to have an ice box. And we would deliver to them every other day anywhere from 15 pounds of ice to 50 pounds of ice for their ice box. At that time, ice cost 3/4 cent a pound delivered. Today they get 10 to 20 times that price for a bag of crushed ice. And so it was a lot of hard work and a lot of different types of work that went in to getting that ice delivered to the various homes. In 1946 also, besides the approximately 300 deliveries at the college, we had approximately 300 more deliveries throughout the town. At that time, the police weren't very interested in giving people tickets, so when I would deliver ice up in front of Woolworth store or some of the other stores on Main Street, I would double park the ice truck, make my delivery, come out, and I never once received a ticket for double parking and was never even told that I shouldn't be double parked. After the ice had been all stored in the barn and covered with sawdust, then of course it was still middle of the winter. And this picture shows the ice pond completely frozen over again after we had taken what we needed off of it. We would invite everyone from Logan City or Cache County, for that matter, to come down and ice skate on the pond. One incident that I remember soon after the war, two teenagers came down to skate on our ice pond. Their father was Dr. Monk, a dentist here in town. That particular day, I guess, wasn't the best for ice skating for some reason or another, and these two kids left and went up to the first dam to see if the ice up there were better to skate on. The girl got too close to the edge of the ice, which was near the dam. And of course the movement of the water there kept the water from freezing. And she got too close, the ice broke, and she went into the first dam water. Her brother, who was just nearby, skated over, jumped in to save her, and they both drowned. I can remember they came down and borrowed all of our ice cutting tools in order to locate them and cut ice where they needed to in order to retrieve their bodies. That was a sad day. This is a picture of my mother, Becky Mullen. She was the backbone of the Natural Ice Company from day one, and she used to work hauling the ice, carrying the ice out of the barn to different people that came to the yard to buy ice, and many times helping to get the ice out of the barn for delivery, which was real heavy work. If you can imagine dragging a 250-pound block of ice through 8 inches of sawdust over to where they were dropped down onto the loading platform. You can see some of the type of work that Becky Mullen used to do. She was a hard worker and always there. Didn't matter whether we were coming home from school or coming home from seeing a show or from ice skating or playing or whatever. Mother was always there, helping with the ice by selling it in the yard on most days. No one else was home but her. She was a great lady and a great mother. And this old ice truck, I would just guess, is a 1935 Ford. Yeah, it says V8 right here on the side of it. And that's the delivery truck. It had a scales which hung off of the back of the truck, so that when we were selling ice uptown or to a resident or something, usually we could guess within a pound or two of what a piece of ice cost when we were delivering it to a home. But if somebody questioned it, we always weighed the block on the back of the truck, and if for any reason it was less than what we were selling for, whether it was 15 pounds or 50, we would cut another block and sell them a bigger block, or give them another smaller chunk of ice to go with it if it was a pound or two less than what it was supposed to be. Many times delivering ice, the kids would come in hordes at some places to get a piece of ice to suck on in the middle of the summer. I can still remember this one home I delivered to. They had a pair of twin boys, and it was their habit to come out while I was delivering the ice into their mother and dad's home. They would steal as much ice or more as what I had delivered. And that's the way they kept their icebox full. I still know those guys today, but I daren't tell you who they are.
Okay.
As you can see, at this time, our telephone number was 1616. And I can remember before that when the number was 170. So that shows you that the ice business goes back a few years. Now this truck doesn't have, well, I can show from this truck.
Okay.
Okay, one of the things that I remember about my dad, and I don't remember too much about him, he came home one day to eat his lunch after delivering ice all morning, and I was playing outside. The truck, some of the trucks used to have a spare tire that sat right in this area over the top of the fender here, and his truck had that extra tire carrier, but it was on the opposite side of the driver. While he was in getting his lunch, I suppose I got tired from playing or whatever, and I crawled up behind that spare tire and fell asleep. When Dad came out, he had no idea that I was there on the other side of the truck, and he drove up to Center and Main and then west to the Owl Billiards pool hall where we delivered ice twice a day. While he was in delivering the ice, another friend of his came walking down the sidewalk And I had awakened at that time and was kicking up quite a fuss, not knowing where I was or where Dad was or why I was there. And this fellow goes into the owl pool hall and tells my dad that there's a boy out here that he thinks he better come out and take care of. And Dad came out and saw that it was me, and when he found out what had happened, he goes right back in and buys a candy bar and brought a candy bar out and gave it to me. And that was kind of a thrilling experience over a dumb thing that I did when I was a kid. It's one of the few things I remember about Dad. I do remember him always at the dinner table. Three of us boys, Emery, Dean, and I, would be sitting on a bench across the table from him. And invariably, as we'd start to eat, he'd point at one of us and he'd say, "Bob, or Emery, or Dean, do you know that food's going right down your throat?" We'd all get a laugh out of that. One of the other things I remember about him was him standing shaving in the bathroom, and that he had little red dots, really, looked like freckles in his face. Blood vessels must have been very close to the surface. And I can remember as he would shave, I would look for those little red bumps to show up. And that's one of the very few things that I remember about Dad. I was only 6 when he and Mother divorced and he left. Funny thing that happened to me when I was a kid, I was watching the yard one day selling ice as people drove in. This couple came in and ordered 15 pounds of ice. So I got a chunk of ice and hung it on the scales and washed it off. And the lady followed me in to the barn to where I was washing the ice, and she says, "Just hand it to me and I'll carry it out in my hands." I says, "Well, I've got the ice tongs on it, there'd be no problem." "No, I want to carry it out." So I reached over and she took it in her hands, and I took the ice tongs off, and then I followed her out to the car to get paid. As we got out to the car and she set the piece of ice down inside the car, she said to her husband, "My hands are just frozen." And he says, "Well, why didn't you let him carry that ice out for you? That's what he was there for." She says, "Oh, it would have been fine, but the little fool gave me the coldest piece he had." Then in 1948, we couldn't store ice anymore, so we had to buy ice from Ogden. And I bought a 2-ton truck and an old one, a used one, and used to drive to Ogden about every other day to get 8 ton of ice. One day as we were coming back, we passed the truck scales where they were checking everyone for whatever weight they had on their truck. And I had driven past that weigh station hundreds of times, and they had always just waved me through. Well, this particular time, they were stopping everyone, and so I pulled in, and I just barely made the weight that they was allowed. But of course I had the ice all covered up with insulated tarps, and they couldn't see what it was I had on for a load, and they couldn't see the sign on the ice of the truck either on account of the blanket. So as I started to pull away, why, this fellow at the weigh station, of course he was an officer of the law, blows his whistle to stop me, and I stopped, and he came running up the truck, and he says, "What is it you're carrying on that truck?" And I says, "It's ice." "Why?" "Ice?" He says, "Back that truck up on the scales." He had just waved me through the first time, so I backed up on the scales, and I just barely made the weight limit, so I didn't get a ticket for that. Another time, as I was driving down to Ogden, I usually took someone with me to help keep me awake, because at that time I was going to school at Utah State, delivering ice, sometimes changing clothes 6 or 8 times a day. And this particular night, I think I don't remember who I had with me, could have even been one of my children. But anyway, as we were going down the south side of Sardine Canyon, there used to be a rope tow there that skiers used to get to the top of the mountain on the west side of the road. Just as I approached that area, I heard a bump, and here came one of my dual tires from the right side, past the truck and out in front of me. And I knew what was happening, but I didn't know what to do about it. Anyway, I tried to stop, and I saw that tire go down the highway about a block and turn across the highway and down into the borrow pit. As I got out of the truck, stopped and got out, I could hear, before I got out, the second tire from that side came off, and I heard and felt the bed drop down on the tire, and then that tire came past the door of the truck and up the side of the mountain on the right side. Well, I jumped out of the truck after stopping it and found out that I had worn the hub off almost flat for 6 inches of the diameter of the hub, stopping the truck and having it slide that distance. I could still hear the air coming out of that second tire. When it had come off, the bed had dropped down, and one of the bolts in the bed of the truck had punctured the tire. So I ran as fast as I could up that hill, and like I say, it was where that rope tow was for skiers, and found the tire just as it was gasping its last breath, or I'd have never found it because I couldn't see which direction it went or anything like that. So that was a thrill. Stopping the truck and having it sliding on that hub caused the truck to pull me all the way across the highway and over onto the side of the road on the other side. But nothing serious came of that. Another time, I usually stopped once on the way to Ogden to see if all the tires were still up and had the pressure in them. This particular night, I stopped at Brigham City, stopped the truck and got out to check the tires. The front tire on the right side was leaning out on almost a 45-degree angle, and there was just one lug nut still holding it. So it was a lucky thing I stopped for that. Another time, as I was coming back with a load of ice in the middle of the winter, and yes, we did have to truck ice even in the middle of the winter. For some reason, my headlights went out as I was coming down toward Logan off of Sardine Summit. And it was snowing, and I could not, it was a complete whiteout. You couldn't tell the road from the side of the road from the mountain. And so I was trying to control the truck and keep it on the highway, and as I would feel my right front wheel go off of the cement, I would just gradually bring it back, and maybe in a few minutes the left tire would be going off of the cement, and I'd feel that and come back on, until I got down far enough where the lights from Logan shone enough that I could see which was roadway and which wasn't. On another trip, coming home late in the night, at 2 o'clock in the morning, I had already stopped at Wellsville and unloaded a ton of ice at one of the grocery stores there, and then pulled out on the highway and headed for Logan. Before I got there, I became awfully sleepy, and I was aware that ahead of me there was a lot of red lights blinking, but I wasn't wide enough awake to realize what it was until I got right close to them. Then it dawned on me that it was taillights that I could see blinking as the cars ahead of me stopped for a train that was crossing the highway. I didn't have time to shift down to help slow the truck down, and I had 8 tons of ice on the truck. So I had to use just the brake pedal, and I don't think I was further away from that train than 30 inches when I finally got the truck stopped. So I had a few thrills along with a lot of hard work working in the ice business.